means that we can use Flexbox on this view, which is the container of text input and button, to control how these two elements are positioned. Because you learned, Flexbox is a concept that is applied to container elements to control how much space the container takes up. That's something we'll do in a second. And then how the elements inside of the container are positioned. That is what we'll do right now. For this, I'll add another style property here in my style sheet object, and I will name it input container. Now on this element, we can now set flex direction to row. And then we can apply this input container styling to this view. So here we add the style prop, and then refer to styles.inputContainer. If we save that, you see the button is now next to the input element. So this already utilizes Flexbox because by default Flexbox is enabled on all those views. You can start using those flex properties right away. The default setting was that flex direction was column, which is why the elements were beneath each other. But if we switch to row as I just did, they sit next to each other in the same row, which hopefully makes sense. Now we might want to control how they are laid out, and for this we can add another property to the input container, and that is the justify content property. You will learn more about all these Flexbox properties in depth in the next lecture, but justify content basically controls how these elements are distributed in the row or column, depending on what the value here is, that they are part of. So here, for example, space between is one of the allowed values, and as you set this to space between, you see there now is more space between these elements. Now we can also still control the width of those elements. For example here, we could add a text input style object in our style sheet object, and I will add this to the text input here. And here I then want to add a border with a width of 1 and a border color of CCC, which is a light gray. By the way, I get a color picker here because of an extra extension which I installed. You don't need that though. And now, in addition, I will give this text input a width of, let's say, 80%. And this is also new. Now, in most places where you can set a size as pixels, so as numbers, you can also set sizes in percentage, though you need to wrap that in quotes. So you set a string in the end. But then you add the percentage sign and your percentage number to set a certain percentage. And with this, I'm saying that I want this element, which has this style, to take up 80% of the available width. The available width will be defined by the container in which the element sits, but then the element which receives this style will take 80% of that container's width. So therefore now I want to add this text input style here on this text input element, and we do this by adding the style prop, and then it's styles text input. If we do this and save that, now we got this border, and this looks like 80% width. Maybe we also want a little bit of margin to the right so that there is some spacing here. There is no spacing right now, despite having space between, because this takes 80% of the width and the button automatically takes the rest. And therefore, to add some spacing here, we'll add a margin to the right on the text input of, let's say, 8 pixels. With that, there is some spacing again. We could also add a little bit of padding maybe so that the text isn't directly on the edge. So therefore, I'll also add padding 8 here on the text input object. So with that, we got some padding as well. Now that's it for this basic introduction to Flexbox. This is not all we'll do. This is not the finished layout. I do see that the spacing is a bit off here on the right and the left. I do see that the button doesn't look that great here on Android. And we will work on this, But first, let's dive a little bit deeper into Flexbox and the different things we can do with it before we then continue working on this app.